Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 54 in the series. This one's all about different directions in knitting, and hopefully that'll become apparent pretty soon. I am coming to you from Urbana, Illinois, where it is a kind of rainy Sunday, but perfect for podcasting. I am a professor there in the English department. I teach science fiction and all that kind of good stuff. Sometimes I talk about my research and my work on here. Not today, but sometimes. And you can find me, if you're looking for me, just about everywhere as Knitting the Stash. On Ravelry and Instagram, obviously on YouTube, and on the blog, which is knittingthestash.wordpress.com. So welcome. It's nice to see you guys. It's been a few weeks since I cast. Usually I try to go every 2 weeks, but last week I was home alone and Spencer was in New York. And I often use his camera equipment to record the cast. Thank you, Spencer. He had all of his camera equipment out in New York, so I was here cameraless, and I decided to just take a week off and give myself a little break, which was lovely, and I got a lot of fleece sorting and other things done instead. But I'm back this week, and I'm very happy to see you all, and of course, welcome to all of you new folks who have never found me before. This is a podcast about knitting, garment modification, and sometimes spinning. And welcome back, of course, to all my friends out there in Fiberland and Yarnland. I've really just, one of the things I love about this podcast is that I get to meet so many new people out in the world and talk to you all about what your projects are and work with you, and you guys push me to do some fun stuff and try some new things. So it's been a great experience thus far, and I'm thinking about it in part because my guild here, the Champaign-Urbana Spinners and Weavers Guild, asked me to give a presentation about podcasts. So on to this coming Tuesday, I'll be speaking to the guild about not only like giving a behind the scenes look at this podcast, but talking about some of my favorite podcasters out there. So it should be a good time, and I can't wait to sing the praises of a lot of you out there who I watch regularly and love to kind of hang out with while I'm knitting. So it should be fun to introduce them to you. And I don't know, I think it'll be a pretty interesting kind of evening. So I'll tell you all about it next time around. On this cast today, I do have a finished object. This is the Turmuck sweater by Nora Gahn, knit in Jun Cashmere, and I'll talk about that. But the reason that we're talking about different directions in knitting is there's this sweater with this beautiful spiral yoke. We got to talk about swatching in the round and swatching in the flat. And I've got my Rumo sweater that I've been working on, which is knit completely sideways. So we're going to talk about a lot of different directions in knitting today. But I also have, I became an ambassador for Making Stories, and they have their first Making Stories magazine out. So I get to share that with you. They send me, what it means basically is they send me a copy for review, and so I get to review it for you guys, and they sent me 2 copies, so I get to give away one of those, which would be really, really fun for somebody to pick up, I think. And I have the next book in our rare, hard to find knitting spinning book series, and this one is a real treasure, so I can't wait to tell you about it. Okay, I think that is, oh, and we have the giveaway. The giveaway announcement for the 2 Frenchy fibers. So tons of stuff on the cast today. Let me jump in and say something more about this little sweater here. This sweater is knit in cashmere, 100% pure cashmere from Jun Cashmere. And I spoke about Jun Cashmere on an earlier cast, trying to kind of revitalize the cashmere market in Kyrgyzstan. And they've been working really hard at that, and right now they're trying to build a mill out there to keep more of the actual production local. So it's a really cool company, and you can hear more about it on the other cast. I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to go back and learn more about Jun Cashmere. This is their knit out of their lace weight yarn, which is, to me, it's a little bit like a light fingering. It's not quite a lace weight to my hands, but they call it a lace weight because they have a lace weight and DK weight. And each skein is 50 grams. This sweater is supposed to take 4 skeins for the size 34 that I knit. I ended up needing just a tiny little bit more than that, and I used up my swatch and everything else. So I think my problem with this was the row gauge. My stitch gauge finally was right on, but my row gauge was a little bit off, so I was knitting more rows per inch than I needed to, which means I would need a little bit more yarn than was called for in the pattern. So luckily, Jun Cashmere had a little bit left of this particular color lot, and I was able to get it from Amy Swanson and finish up this sweater. Like I said, this is a Nora Gone design, and if you're not familiar with Nora Gone, she is kind of the queen of cables. She did some beautiful work, and I knit her Denali sweater, or a modified version of her Denali sweater for Spencer. I think it was 2 winters ago now. Maybe it was just last winter. Anyway, that was a long time ago, it feels like. But she has so many beautiful cable patterns out, and there's actually a new book out that's kind of like a retrospective of all of her designs. So the sweater has some really cool details that I want to tell you about. One is that the cuffs and hem have this lovely little pearl detail. That kind of adds a little bit of specialness to it. The sleeves are knit flat and then seamed. The body is knit in the round, and you're doing decreases and increases along the side seams. And then once you have your sleeves and your body knit up to about, oh, I don't know, 14, 15 inches, something like that, then you join everything to make the yoke. And the yoke is, there's not a whole lot of shaping happening in the yoke until you get to this upper part. So it's a really flattering sweater, I think, for a lot of bodies, because it kind of sits a little bit lower on the shoulders and the neck. And there's a lot of kind of room and give in this area. So if you're thinking of knitting this in the smaller size or in a larger size, I think it would be pretty flattering on a lot of different bodies because of the way that this yoke is constructed. Let me show you the sleeve seaming here. So the sleeves are seamed up the side, like so. And you can see, I guess I'll show you the inside. There's the seam. It's a mattress stitch seam that I did. And it runs all the way up, and you can't even see it. What you can see is this really cool underarm seam, and I did this in mattress stitch as well, but to cinch together the 2 bound off edges, I did a kind of modified mattress stitch, and I talk about that on the project page over in Ravelry, so that it produces this nice, just simple line there that makes it kind of look like an invisible seam on the right side of the garment. But let's talk about this yoke. I'm gonna bring it in a little bit closer here, and I think I'll be able to get it in the camera frame. The dogs are barking. We have 2 puppies, if you don't know. They're a year and a half, and they had a long walk this morning, but they're still a little feisty. So we'll see if they'll quiet down. But let me talk about this yoke. This yoke is knit with this really interesting stitch. So I'm not going to give away the stitch because that's part of the pattern. But there's a really great little stitch that she has. And what you're basically doing is, it's almost like a traveling cable. You're kind of moving that stitch over as you go, and then you're adding in new versions of the stitch for each of these 3 really pretty, there you go, you can really see it. You're adding in different versions of the stitch for these 3, and then you're getting up to the top and doing a beautiful kind of, I love this finished edge on the upper neckline. I think it's just gorgeous. So I think this sweater overall was, one of the challenges with it had to do with that issue of the stitch gauge and the row gauge. So I actually knit this sweater twice. This is the second time I've knit it. And I was knitting the same size both times, but in the first version I swatched in the flat, and so my gauge, which was perfect for the sleeves, was just fine. And this is one of those sweater snafus I told you about. But when I got to knitting in the round with the cashmere, and the piece kind of got bigger and bigger. Cashmere is one of these yarns that is going to drape much more than just like a wool, for example. So when I started knitting in the round, my gauge loosened up, the whole thing kind of draped a little bit, and I ended up with, I think it was just 1 or 2 stitches more. I think it was just 1 stitch more than I was supposed to have for gauge, but that was enough to throw off the entire sweater and make it into more like a size 36, even though I was knitting a 34. So I frogged it, ripped it out, knit it again, and this time I went down a needle size for the body. So I ended up using a US 3 for the body. The sleeves I was able to save because they were knit in the flat and they were on gauge. So I have this much sleeve and this much sleeve and frogged the entire body. I think it worked out really well because the finished product is just perfect, spot on size-wise. I told you I had a little row issue, but this different directions in knitting, since that's our theme for today, I wanted to show you what it's like to actually knit a gauge swatch in the round. And this is something that I'm always a little bit, I'm a huge advocate of swatching. I'm less of an advocate of swatching in the round because I really just dislike the process. But it's absolutely necessary sometimes. And this sweater reminded me why it's necessary. So I'm doing a sample for Wool and Honey, which is a yarn shop up in Michigan. And this will be, I think, the third sweater I'm doing for them. And this is the Lilanau sweater by French Press Knits. And it is an all-over colorwork sweater. And it is knit in the round. So here's my swatch, and here's why it's in the round. See all that stuff hanging on the back there? So all these little dangly threads, yarn bits here, are because I knit this in the round. And to do so, what I did is cast on normally, and then at the end of a row, I would need to then move the piece all the way back to the beginning of the needles, and drape the yarn across the back, so that I would pick it up again over here. So that leaves all these little danglers in the back, right? But it means that what you get in terms of your gauge is what you'd get if you were knitting in the round, meaning you're knitting every stitch, you're not purling back across. So this is my gauge swatch for the sweater, and somebody asked how big I usually make my gauge swatches. I tend to make them like at least 6 inches across, and sometimes like 6 inches tall. And that's because when you measure your gauge, you want to measure kind of this internal part, not the edges. So if you're measuring your stitch gauge, you want to measure in here, and if you're measuring your row gauge, you want to measure in here inside the swatch. So this swatch isn't quite as big, and that's because I really don't like swatching it around, and because I already had to switch needles. So I started with the needle size called for in the pattern, and I was 1 stitch off. Now you might not think 1 stitch matters, but it does. And in this case it would too, because I'm knitting a size 44 bust, I think, for the yarn shop. So if we have 1 extra stitch every 4 inches, and we're knitting a 44 bust size, 44 inch bust size, then that means 4 goes into 44 11 times. So we're doing 11 repeats of that 4 inch thing, and that means we're gonna have 11 extra stitches. And if you divide your gauge, which is 20 stitches for those 4 inches supposed to be, by 4, then you know that there are 5 stitches in an inch. So if you have 11 extra stitches, that's nearly 2 extra inches of fabric on this sweater, so it would become like a size 46. So 1 stitch does matter, and that's why I switched to this 1 smaller size needle for these last few rows so that I could measure my stitch gauge. I knew my row gauge was pretty much on, and it was not a worry with this sweater. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to call this episode Different Directions in Knitting, thinking about knitting in the flat and knitting in the round, which matters when you're working on gauge swatches. And by the way, this sweater the sample that I'm working on is going to be knit in this stone wool, which is an American cornmeal wool, really quite beautiful. A lot of people say cornmeal feels a little bit like cotton, and I found that both with the yarn I made and with this cornmeal, it feels a little bit like cotton, and it just works up really beautifully. So let me get back to this sweater briefly. There are a couple things that I would do differently. One is that in her pattern she calls for you to knit in the flat to begin with, and one of the reasons that a lot of designers will do that with a big sweater like this that you're casting on from the bottom up is that you have tons of stitches and they're all sitting on, you know, long ways on this needle, and you all know if you go to work and join something in the round, you can very easily twist your work, and you'll end up with a kind of Mobius figure 8 kind of design instead of a nice flat join. So what she does, Norgon calls for in her pattern, and a lot of other designers do, is to knit it in the flat for a few rows and then join it together, so that you can really see that it's kind of sitting the right way. But then she moves your beginning of round marker over, leaving the join in the kind of front bottom of the sweater, and I find that that's a little bit of a visible spot. Like if I were doing this again, I would put that join over on the side, right where the side seam is going to be. It just seems a little more invisible to me than in the front of the sweater, but that's a tiny thing, really. The rest of this is just gorgeous. It's cashmere, it is light, and so warm, and it is going to be shipped off very soon to its new rightful owner, and I'm pretty excited to have it finally finished after having knit it twice. So that is the Turmock sweater by Nora Gone. Now you know all that I know about it, and if you go to knit it, you will know little things do matter. The gauge for this sweater, the stitch gauge, matters so much. The row gauge, not as much. So let me tell you a little bit about some other directions in knitting. I've been working on this Rumo sweater that I showed you guys and talked to you guys about a few podcasts ago. So here's Rumo, and it is a pretty funky design for kind of like a vesty sweater. So the sleeves are knit in the round from the bottom up. The sweater is actually knit, as I'll show you, sideways. So, and then you're doing this, you add this lapel kind of at the end. So let me show you where we're at right now. This is my Rumo, and I'm knitting it in the same yarn that she used. And I'm trying to find my bits and pieces of it. Okay. So this is my Rumo. And you can see that it's knit sideways. So let me show you the back. That's the easiest place to see it. The back has two halves. One half that's this way and the other half going the other direction. You can see the stitches going the wrong way, right? Wrong way relative to what we might be used to as knitters. And they're joined with a modified kind of 3 needle bind off in the center here. So you have this back panel that's knit in a different direction, and then you have your front panels that are also knit in different directions. Same kind of vertical design. And a few things about this sweater that are important to think about, because you're not thinking so much about stitch gauge as you are thinking about row gauge. So if in this sweater the stitch gauge matters, as with a lot of sweaters that you're going to knit, when you start knitting horizontally, then you have to start worrying much more about the row gauge. And you can modify row gauge just like you can modify stitch gauge. The easiest way I found in this pattern is you just add rows if you need to, or you subtract rows. But knitting row gauge is a pretty interesting thing. So my swatch for this, I redid it a couple different times, and I was paying much more attention to row gauge rather than stitch gauge. So directions in knitting, it all matters, right? Okay. So I think we're ready to move on from those sweater projects. Yes, I had 3 sweaters on the needles at once. That was a little bit terrifying. This one had 18 rows to go while I waited for the extra yarn. My Rumo was underway, and then I took on this sample. So at one point, yes, there were 3 sweaters on the needles. Now I'm down to 2, and I'll finish the sample before I finish the Rumo probably. So for today I have another little treasure in our rare and hard to find book series. This one is truly, I keep calling it a treasure because that's in its title. It's called Everyday Knitting, Treasures from the Rag Pile by Anamor Sundbo. And this one is something that I talked about on the podcast way back when we first started talking about doing this series on rare and hard to find books in knitting and spinning. And this one is pretty much impossible to find. So I've been searching for it for maybe 6 months to a year once I heard about it, because it just sounded so absolutely fascinating. And I finally found a copy from someone who was destashing on Amazon, and her copy was about a third less than most of the other versions of this that I've seen up for sale. A lot of times I've seen this up for sale for $200 or $300. Crazy. This one I managed to get for, oh, maybe it was like, I think it was around $100, which seems insane, but it's a completely out of print book that's not in libraries because it was printed in Norway, and she's a kind of independent knitwear kind of historian who also owns a mill, which is the story behind this book. And so it's a really hard to find book, and I'm just like treasuring my copy right now. So I want to tell you about it so that you could at least see it. That's one of the things about these books is like if it's really, really expensive, prohibitively expensive, and you can't find a copy, then it's fun to actually just see them. And that's part of the reason we're doing this series, to be able to share this information with other folks around the world. So let me show you the back. This is Anamor Sundbo, and let's see if we can get her on here. There she is in her rag pile. And that is really the crux of this book, is that she basically wanted to learn to like have a mill. She wanted to have a mill and run a mill, and it turned out she was going to take over a shoddy factory, like, to learn. And the folks at the factory said, sure, we'll teach you, but you have to take over the factory. So she ended up with this shoddy factory, and a shoddy factory basically takes in old woolens and kind of shreds them up to make shoddy. And shoddy is used to stuff mattresses, to make insulation, for all kinds of just kind of like repurposed wool things that you'd want to use wool for, but you're not going to knit with it again. So when she inherited this shoddy factory, she basically took over their rag pile, and she started putting some of these rags, as you can see on the cover here, some of these rags through the machinery that would rip them up and, you know, just make them into something, recycle them into something that was usable again. But she started to notice that there was some pretty darn cool stuff in the rag pile, including that sweater that's on the cover. So let me show you just a little bit about what she found. And this, I have to say, one of my favorite things that she found are a bunch of long underwear, woolen long underwear that were knitted. Really pretty cool. But she found a lot of sweaters going all the way back to World War II. And so here are a couple of those. This book is just full of photographs. Here are some of the sweaters that she found. And she basically started sorting them into different styles of sweater and different eras, and trying to do the research to figure out where they came from, what these styles were. Here's a whole page of mittens, Selbu mittens that she found in the rag pile. Right? Tons of mittens. These are all beautiful designs. And people were getting rid of them because, you know, they were older, they have tears in them, they have holes, they just weren't useful anymore. Here's another beautiful set of cardigans that she found in the rag pile, right? And so this book, she spends just a lot of time talking about the different kinds of cardigans, different kinds of socks, different kinds of mittens, and where they come from. So for example, this had, she's trying to find some of the patterns for these sweaters that she found and where they would have originated from. So she found old photographs of men wearing these sweaters that had similar patterns to the ones that she was finding in the rag pile. And she was doing some basic research there, and she goes all the way up with some of them. So some of the newer ones, she has some great ads from, you know, more modern contemporary times that kind of showcase these sweaters. And there's so, I mean, I wish I could show you the entire book. There are so many different styles in here. This is from 1945. These are some of the women's jumpers that she found. So these are things that she found in the rag pile. And then this is an advertisement that she found that's a similar kind of style to what she's looking at in the rag pile. And I want to show you like everything in this book. It's just so cool. And some of the things in the rag pile are in worse shape than others. These guys, for example, show their kind of like history of mending. And that was actually one of the things that really I loved to read early on, was about those long underwear, because she shows how the long underwear were actually oftentimes sweaters that had run their course as sweaters and then were turned upside down and modified so that the arms of the sweaters became the legs of the long underwear. And here's an example of how that works. And I think you can see in this one what the sweater would have looked like if you look at it like this, right? So if you turn your sweater upside down, you can turn it into a pair of woolly long underwear. Who knew? So one of the things I've learned from this book. And I haven't even made my way all the way through it yet because it is just so chock full of history. Here's a bunch, I told you, socks. So here's a bunch of slippers and socks that were in the rag pile. Really cool, different styles. And tons of different ways of covering feet. And so it's just a beautiful, beautiful book that is a huge kind of like cultural history. And she goes through at the end some of those iconic colorwork designs where you'd have the iconography or the images in your knitting and your color work. A really cool book, and at the end she does provide some charts for some of the more well-known or recognized patterns. There are those animals, right? Lots of different icons for color work. Beautiful book. And if you happen to be going to like estate sales or guild sales or looking on Amazon for it and eBay, you may be able to get your own copy. Like I said, I looked for 6 months to a year to get this copy, and finally found one that I thought was like a somewhat reasonable price. It seems to me it holds its value, so if you want to get a hold of it and then read it and then resell it to somebody else, I think that would be one of the books that you could actually keep. It would keep its value, like a good spinning wheel. And so that is Everyday Knitting, Treasures from the Rag Pile by Annemor Sundbo. And she has a website up where she has plenty of other books about knitting, and she's just a really interesting cultural historian. She's kind of become a cultural historian through all of this. So you can check out her website. I'll put it in the show notes and you can see what she's up to. Great book. I'd highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in kind of like the cultural history of knitting, shoddy factories, recycling, and how things get modified and changed over time. Brilliant. Yeah. So the last segment today is a review of Making Stories magazine issue number 1, which is straight out of Berlin and arrived in my mailbox just this week. And as I said, I've become an ambassador for them, which means that they'll send me copies of their publications for review, and I can also do giveaways for you guys, which is really super exciting, and that's what I have. So if you are interested in this magazine after I give the review, we're going to do a giveaway at the end of the podcast. Now, this magazine is kind of like a new endeavor for the editors, and the editors are Hannelise Haferkamp and Verena Kors, who have put out plenty of other Making Stories publications that you're probably familiar with. I became familiar with them when they put out Woods a while back, and Woods is a really gorgeous kind of pattern book, but it's also has some really great techniques. It has some profiles of knitters and yarn. So this is like they have, for example, in this one, Jen Steingass and Isle Yarns. They talk about this beautiful, the Windfall sweater, which many of you are probably familiar with. That comes from these lovely ladies in Berlin. So I'm familiar with them because of publications like Woods, and I was so excited that they were putting out a kind of recurring magazine now. And so this is Making Stories magazine, and it has designs by tons and tons of really cool folks, and it has some nice essays in it. So it's a kind of nice combo if you're looking for something that's not just a pattern book, but it's a little bit like something that you get from Kate Davies or something that you get from Lane magazine, like this idea of combining kind of like cultural immersion, interesting essays, and beautiful patterns all in one. Then if you're looking for that, this is your magazine. So one of the things about these two, and I'll show you, these are our two editors here. They're pretty awesome folk. And they are interested in kind of sustainability and transparency. So the magazine is ad-free. It's printed on recycled paper, and they're keeping production and a lot of what they're doing as local as possible. So I was pretty excited to be an ambassador in the United States for this magazine, given how local and sustainable they're trying to go with the whole thing. So one of the things they do is they want to, they also want to represent knitters and a broad range of kind of bodies, styles, and positionalities and identities in knitting, which I think is really important at this moment, as we're thinking a lot about inclusiveness and diversity, race, class, ability, all that kind of stuff. And so this, the patterns in this book are really nice in that I think they would suit a lot of different bodies. For example, Fluent, which is a really pretty, try to get you a good picture of the sweater. This is the Fluent sweater. On the cover page for this sweater, they say, oversized in the body for ultimate comfort and fitted in the arms to give it the right amount of structure and poise. And it's a sweater that I think would suit a lot of different bodies really kind of nicely. And not only that, but the essays that they include in here are really a lot about diversity and inclusion. So there's one on disability, knitting, and self-care, which is an interesting conversation between Lorna Hamilton Brown and Felicity Ford. And they talk about some of the common themes of disability and knitting and mental health and knitting, which is a really, I think, a useful essay for a lot of people who have never encountered thinking about disability at all, or thinking about disability and knitting. There's a really cool essay in here about, and it's a visual essay, and I'm going to try to find it for you. Yeah, How My Body Became My Home by Camilla Rose Russell, which I love. And she gives a beautiful kind of sense that knitting helped her think about her body in different ways and to like appreciate her body. I love the art here. It's just absolutely gorgeous. It's just so sweet, and it's thoughtful, and it's just, I think for a lot of us, knitting, it kind of is that for us. It's like a chance to get to know our bodies, our measurements, not for the sake of trying to fit into some kind of like store-bought garment that is just randomly sized for the average body, but to think about our bodies as like our bodies, and we want to make things that fit them, make us feel good. So at the end of that essay, she says, I do not see my body in a bad way when I'm wearing a woolly piece. I feel at home and at ease. And I think a lot of us feel very similarly about that. Other patterns in here, there's a beautiful hat, which is in a slip stitch colorwork. So if you like the look of colorwork, but you don't want all of the like yarn dealing, you could knit this hat, which is a slip stitch pattern. It's a really beautiful hat. And this one's called Pili Abe, and it is by Jennifer Barrett. And here's another image of that hat. Really gorgeous. So all told, the issue has 9 patterns, and primarily they're sweaters, but there's a hat, there's socks, and there's a couple of different shawls. And the patterns in the back, most of them have charts. Not all of them, but almost all of them have charts and have written instructions. So that's really, really useful, I think. Everything in the magazine is laid out beautifully. So this is Traversing, one of the sweaters that I posted about on Instagram, and here's the beginning of the pattern page. A lot of beautiful little hand-drawn renderings of these, a page full of abbreviations, and just some really gorgeous photography throughout. So this is the Spring 2019 Making Stories issue number 1. I'm super excited to be an ambassador and be able to review this because there are about 9 patterns that I'd like to knit, especially the sweaters. I'm super excited about these sweaters in here. I think they're beautiful, and they're a wide range from colorwork to cables, cardigans, pullovers, and everything in between. So you know, you'll find something that you're looking for in this issue. Now, the cool thing is, the extra cool thing, is that I have 2 copies. So I have one to give away to one of you. And in line with Verena Kors and Hannah-Lisa Haferkamp's kind of like mission to keep things sustainable and local, since these did come all the way from Berlin, I would like to give a copy away to someone in the United States and not ship it back across the Atlantic. So apologies to all of my wonderful viewers who are out in a different country, but this one's going to be a US giveaway. And what I'd like you guys to do is head over to Ravelry, check out the Making Stories magazine patterns, and let me know in the comments here or on the Ravelry thread or on the blog which is your favorite of the patterns. And I will leave this giveaway open for 2 weeks as usual, and I will select a winner by random number somewhere in the United States and ship you off this beautiful copy of Making Stories. And included in the paper copy is a Ravelry code, so that once you get your paper copy, you'll be able to download the patterns and add them to your Ravelry library, which I think is a really nice touch. Great idea. Whenever I get patterns in paper, and I love patterns on paper, I really also like to have that record in Ravelry. So you have that with this Making Stories issue. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Verena Kors and Hannah-Lisa Hefferkamp for sending along these issues and for inviting so many of us to become ambassadors and help get the word out about some really cool work that they're doing with this magazine, sustainability, independent designers, and thinking about change and thinking about how we can continue to build and grow this knitting community that we all love so much. So thank you. All right, the last little bit is our 2 Frenchy Fibers giveaway from last episode. And if you'll remember, I have these 2 beautiful skeins from 2 Frenchy Fibers. This is Cheryl. Cheryl's new company. She's an indie dyer. And these are both gorgeous colorways. This guy over here is Tiptoe Tulip, and it's 463 yards, 75/25 merino nylon, and a superwash yarn. This guy over here is 200 yards of minis. They're so cute, in Cosmic Fantasy, and this is an 80/20 merino nylon blend. So I have those, and I have the stitch markers to give away. I have 2 sets of stitch markers, 2 different yarns to give away to 2 different people. So we're going to do the random number draw, and I'll let you know who wins. So by random number generator, we have our 2 winners. One is Elizabeth Cada, C-A-D-A. On YouTube, she wrote that Tuscan Rose is one of her favorite colors from 2 Frenchy Fibers. So Elizabeth, get in touch with me. I've just notified you on YouTube. And our other winner is Kari, who is Pahoa Girl, P-A-H-O-A Girl on Ravelry. Congratulations to you guys. Email me to claim your prizes within a week. And as for the rest of you guys, head on over to Ravelry, check out the Making Stories patterns, let me know which one is your favorite, and you can be entered to win the giveaway for that great new magazine that's just come out from Berlin. So until next time, thanks for hanging out with me and talking about directions in knitting, and I will see you in a couple of weeks. Take care, everybody.